All right. I haven't really thought about what I want to say in this, but I had a conversation the other day about some strategy stuff. Um and I wanted to get down a few thoughts about it and probably won't go very long. It's kind of late. But there's a lot of times when there are multiple moves and they of course pose your opponent different problems. So let's put in some vaguely plausible starter. I'm going to put this card here. Is this a good move? I don't think so, um but we'll check if it's losing. And let's consider this a vaguely plausible starter. Okay, it is not losing, but you can see red means a reply to it is losing, so it wins against this reply. So it wins against 3 replies and ties against 42 replies. This is in general indicative that blue should have lots of ways to apply pressure here. If you saw a lot more losses, that would generally indicate a more balanced game, and it would be maybe we have some replies that keep the game level, some with some advantage, some with some disadvantage. Here it's very likely, given the tie loss ratio, that blue has a number of moves that are neutral or fine, but a lot of moves that are going to be a significant advantage and apply pressure in different ways. And in some sense, some moves apply more pressure than others. But in some sense, the question is not actually so much about you, it's about your opponent. In the Ace interview I did forever ago, Ace mentioned that he would try to pose opponents a specific type of problem, and when they sort of passed the test, he would find new types of problems to pose to them. Now, this is not to say that, for instance, say I notice that the only recapture in 2 is 3A78, and that can be comboed back by 7976, and I think, okay, so I want to attack this starter by taking it from 6. Now, actually, both my captures with an A up and 6 have a 5 facing down that potentially gets comboed itself. But let's say I play here with the idea that if you do combo it, I have a combo back. Now, this chain actually is pretty unpleasant looking. So maybe that's not the best idea, but maybe one idea, just imagine the cards were a little different. Again, I didn't look at these cards or choose them. I just asked it to make a random hand. Maybe there's some world where this is a really testing move because the opponent, it's tough to take back in 2. And okay, they also have this plus wall here, but that one we can combo back. That one's kind of scary to combo back as well. That walks into a lot as well, though there's the same in reply. Okay, I'm getting too much into specifics. Imagine this created a problem for the opponent. It is not obvious they can go in 2, and so they have to look for something else and pretend they don't have a natural move in 9. Maybe they do have the combo, but like our combo back actually works for us. So this poses a particular type of problem. Now, maybe it turns out they're actually supposed to go in 2. And if they're supposed to go in 2, there's a certain type of player that will go, I think I'm supposed to go in 2, and they're going to spend a while trying to make 2 work. And even though it looks like 2 doesn't work, and I suspect 2 does not work, no, 2 actually does work. This player will spend a while and they'll go, okay, I think 2 works, right? And they might notice something that I didn't notice, like I have this plus wall back. Now it turns out that doesn't hold. That loses here, I guess, apparently. Um, but like maybe they see some idea like that and they realize I think 2 holds, and they figure out that 2 holds and they play 2. Then against that type of player, this move is not a very effective try because they're extremely likely to play 2, or they're much more likely to find a reason to play 2 even though it looks not so good. Um, there's other types of players that really like to go in 8. They might notice, for instance, that Chrono has combo potential here, or maybe that Saz has combo potential here. For some reason, they can't do it immediately, so they do something like Chrono in 8, saying, okay, Saz is still good in 9, but if you block 9, I have something for 5. Some idea like this. I'm not saying this exactly works. We are not trying to figure out this game. The player who really likes setup moves in 8 is not going to figure out that 2 works, or is not going to spend much time trying to. They might end up playing it, but they're very likely to see something they like elsewhere. They're likely to see something in 8, maybe something in 9, conceivably something in 4. Um, and there's a good chance they find a way to not play the kind of standard move, because we all have different sort of heuristics, and some of us it's, can I make these standard moves work? I look at moves in a narrow number of squares and I look at them more deeply. And other people will check those squares. You know, a strong player is not going to consider 2, but they might move on from it much more quickly when it looks bad and look for ideas elsewhere. So if 2 works, then 6 is maybe a bad idea against some types of players, but a pretty good idea against other types of players. On the other hand, if 8 in fact works, if this is a good move in 8, and it looks like it's a pretty good move in 8, then maybe 2 is really punishable here, and even a player that likes 2 might get really scared off 2 because 2 looks pretty scary, and they might like start looking for other options. But if they're a player that likes 2, maybe they're not as good at finding moves in 8, and they don't find it. I'm not saying players are quite this simple, but there are clearly players that try to make standard moves work. There are players that quickly start looking for more creative options. One of the big differences here is optimistic versus pessimistic evaluators. Where optimistic evaluators, maybe the prime example is D, and you can go read his Occult Fan interview with Vid from forever ago, where he's kind of going, I just want to maximize my combo potential, and I think if I do that, my position will come good. He's not as much scared about what the opponent can do. He thinks if he can create enough, he's going to be in good shape whatever happens. And if he doesn't find ways to create, then he will look for ways to make sure you can't create. But here is a player that is not as concerned about these obvious lock ins as he is about creating substantial combo potential. And if he's looking to do that, and the move that needs to be found is the move in 2, well, he's really likely to play this move in 8, and this might be a really good try versus him. But it might not be a good try versus a more pessimistic evaluator who is trying to make standard moves work. And I think I'm thinking about a game I played versus Seto. Oops, it's the wrong thing to click. Where he started some relatively weak corner in 9. All right, that's the wrong person to be going first. He started, nope, that's not the right square, in 9. And I took it from 8, thinking I was forcing a sequence. Obviously, this is a silly move. Imagine, you know, these are just random cards in these squares. And he plays this Chocobo card in 2. Now, I had 6 ties here, which is enough that I'm under some pressure. I'm probably behind, or few enough, but enough that like I usually tie positions where I have 6 ties with 4 moves left, and I often tie those positions very straightforwardly and with no risk. But this was a very confusing structure to me. It was one I was unfamiliar with, and it was complex enough I didn't have ways to directly clarify it, or at least I didn't see them. After, once a move is pointed out, I go, oh yeah, that does clarify cleanly. But that's a little different. That's a little different than what's going on when you're thinking it through. And it took me out of my comfort zone and into a place where I didn't have natural heuristics, and I was having trouble forcing the moves I was looking at into positions that I could evaluate quickly. And so I would try a move, sort of go, that's ugly, and move on to the next move, because the position was vague enough I couldn't just calculate each line to the end and be confident in it. So I was looking at, I don't know how many moves, you can probably find the video, like 4 moves here, and like 2 of them did tie and 2 of them didn't tie, and I ended up picking a non tie, but it was a really fantastic move for beating exactly me. When I played the move in 8, I had checked moves in 6, I had checked moves in 7, I think I had checked stuff in 4, and I think I would not have lost the game if Seto had played any of those moves. But he found a move that made it really difficult for me to play. But if he made that move against, I don't know, maybe Vid, maybe he doesn't win that game against Vid, but he does win it against me. Because I think Vid is a player who would have been more comfortable in the circumstances that were presented to him. And I think, especially as players get stronger, a lot of the questions of how to win games are not quite the same as what gives my opponent the fewest ties, or even what gives them the ties that are hardest for me to find. Because the question to optimize is what gives them the ties that are hardest for them to find. And between strong players, there will be a lot of overlap. Style differences are very real and substantial, but they're not as big as skill differences. And so, you know, you might find two very strong players, whatever the two players you think are strongest that are the most distinct are. If it's move 7, they're going to make the same move because move 7 is just within the range that skill is going to determine their move. It will not come down to style. Now, maybe they'll choose different ties there. Maybe not. Maybe they will. Depends on also if there are different ties available. But for the most part, that's an easy example of when skill dominates over style. The earlier in a game you go, the more style is going to determine rather than skill, but sometimes to a lower extent than you would think, even as there are really distinctive style differences. But what I wanted to say was there's sort of you're trying to optimize for what your opponent has the most trouble with. And this often works out more simply. I think there are closed players who are very good at this, who realize there are certain formations that they can use against specific opponents that those opponents struggle with. There are certain, for instance, bluffs you can do where if you flip a card, they will assume you have the combo and they will play safely. And if you play a new player, they will just never assume you have anything. And so if you just have the thing and just hold it in reserve, they will not play to block you playing the thing, and you often get free and easy wins. But there are other players that if you play a move that says, I have this, they will assume you do in fact have it, and you can get away at a high rate with not having it. Open is an open information game. It is more difficult to do this, but we are all finding positions which another player would have tied, or that we would have tied and they didn't. And some of that's strength, but some of that is that we're good. We learn to solve different problems. We get comfortable in different positions. And an optimal player is not going to be playing like what you'd call in poker game theory optimal. They're going to be playing what you'd also talk about in poker as the problems that your opponent, this isn't quite how most poker players would describe it, but the problems that your opponent is least comfortable solving. And doing that is a really interesting thing. One more thing I want to mention here, and that I found kind of fascinating, is when I built the Spade and Joker bots, which have been around forever, so I think people listening to this will be familiar, um, they came out fairly similar strength. Spade did slightly better against the other bots, but Spade and Joker just looked very similar in performance tested against other bots. And when I've tested them against humans, they have very similar win tie loss ratios. Like if you take wins plus half of ties divided by total games, they have basically the same win percentage. Very close. It's varied a little over time, but very close. If you look at how many points per game they get, 10 points for a win, 6 for a tie, 3 for a loss, or whatever, very similar. Just across metrics, very similar gain of rank. Whatever metric you want against the Triple Triad community, they have very similar overall results. Except they get there in different ways. Spade wins and loses a bunch more, and Joker ties a bunch more. Now, their wins versus loss ratios pretty similar, wins minus losses, those are different things, but they're both pretty similar. They have similar overall win rates in terms, if you would like include ties, but Joker has a lot fewer decisive games, and Spade has a lot more, which is really interesting because Spade is programmed to play quite defensively, and Joker is programmed to play much more combatively and exciting combo setting up moves. And you'd think that the defensive player would have fewer decisive games and more ties. They are playing more safely. While the aggressive combative player would have more wins and losses, fewer ties. And in this kind of clear test, because they've stayed the same over time, their programming allows them to play complexly. They'll play very different games at times. but they have clear programming that has stayed consistent over time. I have not messed with either of these bots. And the bot that is more combo oriented and more oriented towards playing against what the opponent's trying to do rather than playing just to build stuff of your own and build like safe squares of your own, that bot is a lot more tie oriented. And that's interesting, I think, in a kind of thinking about styles and what those styles achieve and ways to pose problems to different styles. I think that's a really interesting data point that we now have, hundreds and hundreds of games of these fixed bots that play these different styles. And we see they have quite similar strength, but quite different ways of getting there. And that I suspect means that the problems you pose one are different. I think this is pretty clear. Different than the optimal problems you should pose others. Now, humans are much less consistent thinkers. One day you might see something, the next day you might not, in a way where the bot, if it gets the exact same position, it's going to play the exact same move. Slightly different position, might play something quite different, but exact same position, it will always play the exact same move. And me, one day to the next, I might do something different. There are a few moves that appeal to me, and something I spot in one day, I might not spot. I might spot something different in another. All that. But the bots are consistent, and they're an interesting test. And we see two bots of similar strength and different style, and we see not just different moves working against them, but that they get to their win rates quite differently and not the way you'd expect. Again, the aggressive player has a much higher tie rate. I just think that's interesting. I'm not sure it's all that relevant. I guess my main goal today was to say I think if you're having trouble beating a particular player and that they're like in a skill range where you think you should beat them, it's interesting to think like maybe the types of questions I pose opponents, the way I tend to play that poses certain types of problems to opponents, maybe this is an opponent that is very good at solving that kind of problem. And the reason they're in my skill range is, other people around my skill do better against them than I do. Maybe I need to try to pose different problems. I do think this was something Yojimbo was very good at, because he really did try to optimize as much as possible. And this was something he did of figuring out what kind of problems he wanted to pose different opponents. And I'm not saying this will you know, I'm not saying I've been, playing a lot of adjacent corners, but if I just switch to far corners, this opponent I struggle with will immediately fall apart and I'll win trivially. But there are players who clearly respond better to adjacent corners than far corners. Back in the day, playing close no combo, this will be my last point. I hope some of my points here made some sense. I don't know. I'm just babbling. It's late. I'm going to go to sleep. But, you'd play some weak corner starter, some corner starter. That's not the player on first turn. So let's say something like, yeah, let's go back to this starter. You play some starter like this, or your opponent plays a starter like this, and I would play. Remember, this is closed, no combo. I would play some adjacent corner, and a huge percentage of my opponents would play the in between square, which is, as I've noted, often the correct square to play in open combo, but not a good square to play in closed no combo. And now I would have a free choice to set up various L options. I would really try to find one that set up a threat in 5. Here, it's possible we don't have one, which is a bummer, because now I can't show, my point so well. So maybe I should come up with a different quick example here. Say something like this, and you make some move. I don't know, that's a pretty ugly move. You make some move like this. And you've set up an L, and you're the first player to lock in a player. And if they go for the sort of long L, now you've just very likely just won the game on the spot. You're up so much, you're locking in so many more cards. And I just won a ton of games on second turn just going for L's, which is very basic strategy, but just second turn locks in a card first. And yeah, I'd win a lot of games. Going in the in-between square was poor. And as soon as I realized a player, like, maybe the player just doesn't have cards for other squares, right? And maybe they have just really good cards if the right fills up. I'm not saying this move is always wrong, but on that rule set, if an opponent was playing it more than like 20% of the time, they were making a massive mistake. And there were people playing it like 80 to 100% of the time, even like pretty decent players. And this just meant I should always play an adjacent corner against those players. It's just, I mean, maybe there was some other exploit that was even stronger. But if someone goes here 80% of the time and close no combo, I should play an adjacent corner every time. That's how to optimize my score against them. And if they don't do that, maybe someone else responds with the three corners. And maybe I really struggle against the three corners. Maybe I'm not Seto and Turds playing 1,000 games of three corners in closed trade every day. And I am less comfortable with this and I don't like defending it. Let's say that's the case. Then I shouldn't be playing adjacent corners against that opponent. And we're all going to have structures we've played more and less and are more and less comfortable with. And I just think there's something really interesting, not just even from like a structural perspective, but from just a how do you pose people different problems? One is to throw different structures at them, but one is to sort of pose different amount of combo threat at them. I think that's another interesting way to do it. And just thinking, if I'm having trouble with this player, if they're showing a lot of skill playing certain types of positions well, maybe I should be trying to get different types of positions against them and how to achieve that. And also noticing, like, maybe they've done worse against another player. What kind of positions is that person getting against them? Can I learn to do something like that? I don't know. I think there's some interesting questions here. And I think, like, when I'm calculating a position, I'm giving what I think the best and main line is, usually. And this is assuming my opponent will play what I think is best. And I do personally try to play towards what I think is game theory optimal. I am not doing a lot of trying to exploit opponents. I think I'm doing a pretty minimal amount of that. And if I am doing that, it's usually something not shown in my videos because it's usually something I was thinking about when hand constructing for tournaments of like what kind of positions do I think I'll be drawn to with this hand and do I want those against this opponent? And that's something that I tend like it's really hard to talk out. I tend to sort of like just think about it over the day. Anyway, that's not very important. The important part is like you don't have to do this to be really good, but I think it's a neat direction that players could go of how do I pose my opponent different kinds of problems. Yeah, I guess I'm just repeating at this point. All right, we'll end the video.